Thank you very much. It really is a privilege to be speaking here in front of you. I'm very thankful for all of you for coming, for showing interest in the book, and particularly our speakers and panelists and special guests who are here with us. I'm just going to speak for a little bit about the book. One of the things I've learned is a lot more people want to buy a book than actually read it. And one way of getting them to read it is actually to make it a bit more interesting for them. We have in India a tradition, a historical tradition, a literary tradition of things starting with a journey, a yatra. And in some ways, this book was a yatra. It started because of a journey. Between 2016 and 2019, I was based here in Delhi. I was living here. I was working at what was then called Brookings India, now the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Actually, Shamika was a dear colleague of mine at that time. And one of the things that time did is it enabled me to travel the length and breadth of India, from Kerala in the south to Khardungla in Ladakh to the north, from the Ahmedabad in the west to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the east, and various places in between, from Bhopal and Bangalore to Pune and Mussoorie and other places. And one thing I learned, my experiences, every one of these places I went to, I was often interacting with students, not just students of international relations, although those as well, but also law students, engineering students, but generally young Indians. And one thing that came across was, at that time, this is 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, there was a great deal of interest and hunger and curiosity about India and its place in the world. People wanted to know, what is India's story? Where does India stand? And they had a lot of questions. And they would ask me, I'm so interested in this subject, what should I read? And I would refer them to books. I would say, if you want to read, learn about India-China relations, read this. If you want to learn about India and its neighborhood, read Professor Muni. If you want to, learn about India's nuclear program, read such and such a book. But there wasn't a good place to start. And many of these books, while very deeply researched and very insightful, weren't often very accessible to somebody who didn't know much about international relations, who didn't know where to start. Or they were often, they used a lot of jargon, they used a lot of theory. So in some ways, that was really what prompted me to write this. And much of the research for it I actually did in those years, 2016 to 2018. Events got in the way. As you may know, something happened in 2019, which there was change in government. Someone I was related to suddenly became, to my surprise, became Minister of External Affairs. And suddenly I said, maybe I should rethink some bits of this book. But more than that, other events took precedence. I joined ORF to set up ORF, what became ORF America, and moved to Washington. Then there were other circumstances. We had a pandemic, some major geopolitical events. We had clashes between India and China, a war between Russia and Ukraine. And so all of this prompted me to really rethink the book. And one of the things a struggle I had over the past previous years was how to make it a bit more easy to read, more accessible, give it a logic, give it a flow. That made it a bit more difficult. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What the book does, essentially, and you can see on the screens here, is I try to do three things. The first was provide a history. So in about less than 200 pages, a brief but comprehensive overview of India's interactions with the world, from ancient times to 2024. And I actually used the G20 summit last year as a cutoff point. A second, and the part two of the book, is a national strategy. One of the things people say is, does India have a national strategy? What is it? So this is my attempt at trying to define, at the very least, what are India's objectives, and these are what I think are mostly timeless objectives, and what should be priorities? What should people in government or outside of government be thinking about? It's not comprehensive. It's the greatest hits. But I do think it's a helpful way to think in a systematic and logical way about India and its role in the world. And finally, I wanted it to be a jumping off point. This should be an intro for somebody who's sitting for the UPSC exam and wants to join the Indian Foreign Service, or who is a diplomat coming to India who wants to know the basics about India and its place in the world. And so I have at the end over 250 books categorized by what they're about. If you want to know more about India-US relations, here are 10, 12 books to read. If India-Pakistan, India and its neighborhood, India and technology, India and the economy, national security, and so forth. This is the main structure. There are 5 chapters on the historical chapters, a very long one on India before independence, which gives, again, a very small, quick, slightly superficial, but comprehensive, what I hope is comprehensive view of India's interactions with the world before it became an independent country. Then 2 chapters on the Cold War, and 2 chapters on the post-Cold War period. And each one I have gotten questions already about why I define things in a certain way, why did I use 2008 as a cutoff point, and largely it's because of international circumstances. The second part of the book has 5 chapters, which I say are the 5 main objectives, and I'm going to go in a little bit of detail. What I thought I'd do, instead of narrating the whole book, is just give you 10 quick highlights, which I think I've described them as lessons, but in some ways the lessons are for the reader themselves to draw. The first lesson, I think, going to sort of deep history, is that India has a long tradition of strategic thought, strategic practice, and strategic culture. And this is not often appreciated by people in India, let alone outside of India. For this, I went back to material culture, but also the documents of, from the Vedas, Ashoka's edicts, epics, but also prescriptive texts, and which India has a very strong tradition. Equally interesting, and I think worthy of much more research by people, is I found the early modern period in India to be fascinating. There was a period of time before the onset of European colonialism where you had a number of very strong Indian states that were jostling for power with themselves and with external powers as well. And in some ways, we still have it matters today because the legacy of some of that still affects our relations with Afghanistan, with Tibet, with Myanmar, and the periphery. A second lesson is I kept on learning more things about India's long interactions with the world. And Samir actually mentioned this in his opening remarks, that even before the arrival of Vasco da Gama in 1498, Indians were interacting directly or indirectly with a very vast geography, stretching from East Africa, from Mozambique and Tanzania, to across the Indian Ocean, to what is today Indonesia and the South China Sea, as far north as Central Asia, and as far west as the Mediterranean, and indirectly even farther, up to Japan and Korea on the one hand, and to Morocco and Spain and Scandinavia on the other. Again, there's a common view that India was a world apart. It is how Henry Kissinger actually described it in one of his books. But factually, that's misleading at best and erroneous at worst. A third lesson from pre-independent India, and one that really stayed with me, was a combination of factors. One, the world took an interest in India even when India did not take an interest in the rest of the world. And that there was a natural logic of trade and connectivity that brought people to India, that shaped India's environment in many ways. And combined with that, the importance of the maritime domain. And that really what changed so dramatically in the middle 18th century was that suddenly you had a monopoly of power in the Indian Ocean. Until that point, it was a contested space. And so it has very immediate lessons for today. Which is why India should not ensure that there is another monopoly in the Indian Ocean, and that it would have very existential consequences for India today. Oh, I jumped forward. A fourth lesson, moving to independence, is from the stroke of midnight on August 15th, India and its leaders had to deal with the question of the use of force. And it was very immediate on the question of the annexation of princely states, but also with completing the process of decolonization with French colonies and certainly Portuguese colonies as well. But moving forward, there is with quite a great frequency, India had to contemplate whether or not to use force, how to justify it. when it was appropriate, and so forth, in a variety of contingencies with China, with Pakistan, and in the neighborhood. People, of course, know the major wars of 1962, 1965, 1971. But also, what I tried to highlight is episodes such as Natula in 1967, Samdorongchu in the 1980s, Siachen in 1984, and others. And again, when you bring it up to the present day, this is these lessons from these episodes are worth contemplating today. And when we think about the surgical strikes or Balakot and other recent incidents. A fifth lesson, and one, again, this is one I actually had to learn a lot, was how much foreign policy was connected to domestic policy. Not just now, although perhaps the salience of that has increased, but even earlier, even from independence and perhaps even before. And I actually had to dig quite deep into economic history, a field I had less familiarity with, on industrial policy, the 5-year plans, and the consequences, both how these domestic economic policies were shaped by India's interactions with the world, for better, sometimes for good, sometimes not so good. But also it had consequences for India's role and power and its ability to shape international outcomes. And on the positive side of the ledger, there were episodes such as the IITs, the establishment of the IITs with international assistance, the Green Revolution, the software boom in the 1990s. But there were also negative consequences of that, and I go into that in some detail. Related to that, it's not just the economic realm, but technology has always played a very important role. I devote a fair amount of attention to the history of the nuclear program, but there equally important was space, telecom, and a number of other technologies over the years. And one of the things, again, I learned in the process was sometimes how some of these efforts were stillborn, good ideas that were not fully implemented. A sixth lesson, one that I think would be appealing or of interest to a lot of people, is really the origins of the China and Pakistan challenges for India. And again, people read the news today or in the last few years, but in sometimes the context, why did we end up with war in 1962? Were there opportunities to engage Pakistan before 1965, when the relationship changed in a very dramatic manner? And so, again, a fair amount of the narrative also goes into these two relationships in particular, which have loomed large in India's strategic consciousness. A seventh lesson, and this is getting into the policy side, is, and therefore more my own views rather than sort of descriptive or objective reality, is I make the case that India has long had a national strategy, even if it has not always been articulated. But beyond that this has been a largely realist and interest-driven strategy. And if anything, the chronological narrative also shows episodes where India deviated from that, and sometimes that had costs with, in terms of relations with the United States, with China, with Pakistan. And so it does make a somewhat unabashed argument that India is always best served when it prioritizes interests over ideology. Lesson 8, we've been seeing a lot in the news lately on Bangladesh, on Nepal, on Sri Lanka. And one of the things, until quite recently, there's very little scholarship on India's relations with these countries, which are quite important for India, obviously. But when you go to Kathmandu and Dhaka and Colombo and Male, for them, India looms very large. And what I wanted to do was actually put the neighborhood front and center in this narrative. And indeed, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the neighborhood and some of the structural realities that India has to contend with. But I also go into the past, the civil wars in Nepal and Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan case, Indian intervention in that, but even previously treaties that India signed with these countries, which I think is important and is often less appreciated today. Ninth, one thing that comes out particularly in the policy, the part 2 of the book, is how much China's rise looms large in India's overall foreign policy, not just bilateral relations with China. And one can make the case that China, what China does and how China behaves, influences India's relations with many other countries and regions, from Russia to Pakistan to the United States to Southeast Asia to Africa. But also a number of other policies related to that, to India's trade policy, technology policy, defense procurement, and so forth. And so it's quite, I think, quite stark that China today, and actions that China takes or does not take, in various ways affects India's policy on many other issues that until 20 or 30 years ago were not necessarily impacted in the same way. And the lesson for that actually for India is that we need to understand China much better. And finally, what I've tried to do is, we're here at a venue associated with Pandit Nehru, India's first Prime Minister. His portrait is actually on the wall in front of me. But one of the things I try to do is show how much has changed, particularly after 1991. Beyond non-alignment. In some ways, true non-alignment, at least as Nehru envisioned it, really only lasted for a very brief period, arguably from about 1953 to 1955, 1955 being when the Soviet leader Khrushchev came to India, to 1965. And certainly by 1971, when India signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, we really saw the end of non-alignment as it was originally envisioned. So it was really only a 10-year period or so that we really had non-alignment, true non-alignment, if you will. Of the latter 2 decades of the Cold War were informed by India's alignment with the Soviet Union. But then after 1991, the circumstances changed, and you had about a decade and a half of US unipolarity and the conditions around that and how it affected India. And then after 2008 in particular, China's rise and the consequences of that for India's strategic environment. Finally, I have tried to make this book interesting and engaging and fun to read, rather than just simply a list of names and places and dates. And so I've tried to litter it with anecdotes that I thought were sometimes not important per se, but in some ways interesting or curious. And so I hope readers, even the most well-informed readers, may know a lot of the story and a lot of the content of the book, but even they will find 1 or 2 things, hopefully, that they will say, oh, I didn't know that, that's interesting, I wasn't aware. And these are just some of the examples I give. I certainly wasn't aware that there was an army of 10,000 African mercenaries in the Deccan in the 17th century, that an Indian started a communist party in Mexico, the building of the Delhi metro, that was a particularly interesting thing, and how at least 7 countries were involved in various ways in terms of financing, technical assistance, training, in building something that we now take for granted here in this city. So I found there was evidence of a trade agreement between Romans and Kerala that goes back 2,000 years, arguably India's oldest surviving trade agreement. It's in a library in Vienna, in Austria. So again, I've tried to litter it with some interesting things, episodes like that. Finally, without further ado, I just want to give my thanks to many people and their kindness and patience and wisdom that I have benefited from. First of all, ORF and Samir and all of his colleagues and my colleagues who made this event happen. It's a great team. We are a global team now. We have presence in 3 cities in India, in Washington, in the UAE as well. We do activities. I was in Brazil 2 weeks ago, Germany last week. Half of ORF was in South Africa a few days ago. So we're really now truly a global team, and it's been very exciting to work with ORF over the past few years. Secondly, I want to give my thanks to Penguin. They've been extremely patient because I actually agreed to write this book in 2016 and it's only materialized 8 years later. So they've been extremely patient and generous with me. And so do want to thank Mansi and her colleagues. And finally, I want to thank many, many people whose work I drew upon to make this. Some people obviously more actively, some of them at institutions I was affiliated with, at ORF, Brookings India, and other places I've worked. But also, I probably cite at least 300, maybe more authors, some of whom are actually in this room, whose work I drew upon, and they did the hard work of mining the archives, of translating things, of diplomats who wrote down their memoirs, which have proved invaluable, and so many people in the strategic community who I want to give my thanks to, and certainly the people you're going to hear from next. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this book.